presentation for today. Let me zoom. Ooh, that's a little bit too much. So we'll go here. All right. So yeah, we're going to cover seller concessions and buyer rebates post NAR settlement. Because it works a little bit differently right now, mostly with the buyer rebate. So if you're doing a buyer rebate and you want to put that into, your BRBC and things like that, I do have a little verbiage for you at the end here that you can use for that. And I'll show you why it's good to use that specific verbiage, because if you're not, again, this is working a little different now. So we're going to run through seller concessions, and then we'll get into the rebates, and we should wrap up right about 10 o'clock today. So if you have questions along the way, please throw them in the chat or raise your hand if you want to, ask live. That's fine too. So seller concessions. I think this is a great time to bring this up because one, we're post NAR settlement, so that happened, 2 days ago on the weekend. So everybody should be writing in prior to touring a property. You need to have a compensation agreement in place prior to touring or prior to writing your offer, whichever comes first. And that could be the PSRA or the BRBC. We went over those last week, but you need to have either one of those in place with your prospective buyer prior to touring or prior to offering on the home. So please make sure you're doing that. Those will be a file requirement. I do not know how stringent MLS is going to be with, moderating us with this. It could start off kind of light, but if they're finding that a lot of agents aren't doing this or aren't doing it well, we could see some real heavy restrictions potentially, because they're afraid of getting sued, and everybody's afraid of getting sued, and we are under a, being scrutinized as an industry right now. So we really need to make sure that we're getting those in place. And they are on the file checklist now. File checklists have been completely updated with all the new forms and everything like that. So you'll find that in paperless pipeline like usual. If you put in a file, if you created a file a couple weeks ago, you're probably still working on the old checklist. But anything you start brand new is going to have the new checklist in there. So we'll start off with what is a seller concession. And with the market slowdown, I'm getting a fair amount of calls from the team saying, wow, my listing is really slow right now. And, there's a multitude of factors. I mean, throw them in the chat if you have an idea of why it might be slower in your area or maybe what you're doing. But some of it, buyers are saying they were waiting until after, this NAR settlement. Some of them, obviously the rate thing has been, a common complaint for the past 2.5 years. Some of them are waiting until after elections. Like there's a whole multitude of things, of why buyers are kind of holding off, but inventory has been creeping up in many areas, not every area, but many areas. And I am getting a lot of feedback from our team saying the listings are kind of sitting right now, not a lot of activity, not a lot of multiple offers going on, unless it's a real hot listing. So this is a good time to talk about seller concessions with your prospective buyer, because we get into these little windows of opportunity in the markets where a seller can or a buyer can make an offer potentially under list price and get it, or potentially list price with some credit towards their closing costs, and they can keep a lot of money in their pocket. And it's a great way to structure a deal if the opportunity is there, because at any opportunity I have to keep more money in my pocket, I'm going to try it. So this is where the seller concession comes in. So this is going to lower the overall cash to close needed by the buyer. So this cash to close is going to be your total closing cost plus your down payment. So that's their total cash to close. Well, if there's a credit built in, that can offset the amount of out of pocket they need to bring in for their closing costs. Now, generally this cannot be applied towards the down payment. I don't even know of a loan program, maybe some of the MLO team on here does, but the down payment typically needs to be sourced from the buyer's funds or gift funds. The seller concession or the credit can be applied towards any and all of the closing costs. So essentially, the seller is agreeing to a credit that's applied towards the closing costs, which are part of the overall cash to close. The buyer needs to write a wire or write a check for prior to close of escrow. So closing costs for buyers usually average between 1 to 5%, depending 1 to 5% of the loan amount, depending on what type of loan they're doing. Really, I've seen it 1%. Usually I quote people more in the 2% range if they're going kind of standard conventional. If they're getting into FHA, VA stuff, I quote them a little higher. 5%, I mean, you're looking at maybe some private money or something like that, a pretty expensive loan to get into. I don't see that too often. Usually I see stuff around the 2% range, 2.5 sometimes. So like it's a big gap that I'm quoting right there, but there's so many factors that go into loan costs and why they are what they are. So it's important to know what kind of loan your buyer is getting and to connect with the lender to see what the estimated closing costs are going to be. This can be seen on the buyer's LE, also known as the loan estimate. So, if you're saying, hey, yeah, I think we get a 3% seller credit on this deal, and the buyer doesn't need that much because the lender says, you know what, we need about 1.5, 1.75, something like that. There's no sense in asking for so much more credit unless they're going to use it towards buy down costs and stuff like that. But even that can be capped sometimes. So have the conversation with the lender if either the borrower does know that that they absolutely have to have a seller credit in order to make this work, or if you think there's going to be the opportunity to build this in. So what can the seller credit be used for? Yes, it can be used for the real estate compensation, and it can be used for any of these items here, credit reports, escrow fees, courier fees, discount points, buy down costs, stuff like that. I mean, basically, almost anything that is a closing cost for the buyer, this seller credit can be put in place to help offset that cash out of pocket for your client. So there are caps with how much a buyer can receive from the seller, though. So you do need to keep this in mind when you're structuring your offer and having that conversation with the lender and knowing what type of loan your buyer has, because that's really important as to the maximum amount of credit they can receive. So Fannie Mae guidelines for conventional conforming. So QM loans, we have principal residence or second home with 10% or less. They can get up to 3% in seller credit. Principal residence or second home with 75.01 to 90% down payment, they can actually receive up to 6% in seller credit, which is a pretty large amount. You can get some real good buy down with that. And principal residence or second home with 75% or less in down payment, up to 9%. I truthfully have never seen anybody get 9% or even need 9% in closing costs, but hey, you can. Investment property, regardless of the amount of down payment, is going to be a 2% cap on seller concession. So you can't get more than 2% in seller concession to be applied toward that. FHA loans are 6%, VA loans are 4% max. So you can use this as your guide to structuring your offers on the maximum amount of credit you can ask for and receive from the sellers. Cash to close. So that is the amount of money the buyer brings to close of escrow. So the wire they bring over for the remaining amount. Obviously, they've already put in their earnest money, so that gets applied as well. So whatever the difference is between all of that is the amount of money they bring in. Total closing costs is going to be the EMD, which is going to show as a credit on the settlement statement. Seller concessions is going to show as a credit, plus down payment equals cash to close. So how does this keep money in your buyer's pocket? So let's say you have a first-time buyer with enough money for the down payment, but not enough to cover their closing costs as well. You would simply find a home with a seller that is willing to contribute to the buyer's closing costs, the seller concession. So that the buyer can close the sale. So the example could be seller takes a hit on the net proceeds. So let's say kind of a slow listing, maybe it's been on the market a long time. They're kind of getting a little desperate to sell, or they have some motivation there. So let's say the purchase price 500K. The buyer is using FHA financing, which is going to be 17.5 in down payment. So that's 3.5% standard FHA loan. That would be their down payment amount. And then their closing costs are going to come out to, let's just say 3%, based on the loan estimate you see. So that would be about 15,000. So the total amount of cash the buyer needs to close now is going to be about 30K that they need to bring in. Maybe they don't have that amount. Maybe they only have 20K available. So they can cover their down payment, but they can't cover their closing costs. So let's say the buyer is going to offer the 500K. They ask for the seller to contribute 3% towards their closing costs. You have to keep in mind that when you do this, this isn't free money that comes out of thin air. This comes off the seller's net proceeds. So in this instance, if you're asking for the $15,000 in credit, you're essentially offering $15,000 less to the seller. So keep that in mind. It does affect their net proceeds. Let's say they agree. Escrow adds a line item to the settlement statement for 15K. Credit from the buyer or to the buyer from the seller's proceeds. The seller's credit ends up covering all the buyer's closing costs, and the buyer's cash to close is now just the down payment amount is 17.5. So this would be the best case scenario because you've actually negotiated down from the original price and built in the closing costs off of that. So you haven't built them on top of the loan or had to add them in on top. So this is the best case scenario because the buyer is actually getting a better deal. If you're building it in, so let's say you have a very firm seller, they're stuck on their price, they don't want to move down on price. You have the same scenario. Seller wants full price, they offer 515 to the seller. And then they ask for the seller to contribute 3%, which is 15,450 at that point. Now you're kind of building the closing costs on top of your offer price. The seller is netting right about the same amount of money as they would have been with a full price offer, no seller concession. But essentially the buyer is kind of financing them in now, but they don't have to come out of pocket with the extra 15,450 now. They're still coming in with just their down payment. So that's the other way to kind of finagle it, and anywhere in between. I mean, sometimes you're splitting it, maybe you're offering, 1505 or 1510 and then asking for the 15,000 in seller credit. So the seller's coming down on their net a little bit, but the buyer isn't financing in the entire amount on top of the price. So obviously you can structure this in a lot of different ways, but those are just, two examples of what it would look like and how it saves your client so much money. Well, doesn't really save them the money. It keeps the money in their pocket. The costs are still there, but instead of, it draining their bank account, it stays in their bank account. So this is really good for the fixer homes and stuff like that as well. The important thing to remember on that is you need to know the value of the home really, really well, what the home values are, because you still have to make appraisal. So if, it's already priced at the top of the market or what you think the value is going to be, and then you start building on another 15K or 20K or something like that, now we're getting into a realm where maybe the home isn't going to appraise, and this may not work out all that well. So take a real good look at the comps. before you start doing this kind of thing where you have to build it on top or something like that. If it's a really competitive property or the seller is very firm, know what the values are there. So let's roll into buyer rebate real quick, and then I'll share my screen on the RPA and show you just a couple sections on how to do this, as well as your buyer compensation agreement that you now have to have in place. So I see a lot of misconceptions. Actually, before I get into this, I see some stuff in the chat real quick. So let me get into that. Yeah, people are saying slow down in San Diego, people waiting for rates to come down. Yeah, Manny said on a $1 million sale, he just negotiated credit for 15K and a termiting clearance. So yeah, we're starting to see some wiggle room here from the sellers for sure. Okay, that has to do with the signs. So on buyer rebates. So is it legal to rebate your commission to a buyer? And it is. A rebate is not a referral fee. It is a rebate. So it is legal to rebate a commission to a buyer. However, it is best to qualify your promise of a rebate in 3 ways. Stated on the closing disclosure, paid through escrow, not disapproved by the lender. So, because there could be a loan program or an amount that could be disapproved from the lender. So you've promised your buyer X amount of rebate from your commission. And lo and behold, you get into underwriting and the underwriter says, no, you can't do that. And you haven't made this disclosure right here that I'm going to provide this credit to you from my commission, this buyer rebate, unless it's disapproved by the lender. So that can come up and that could get you in a pickle because you've made this promise that you can't fulfill because of regulations. So keep that in mind, add that little tiny clause to your promise to the buyer for the buyer rebate. Does the rebate have to be stated on the purchase agreement? Typically, no, but the lender should be made aware of it all the time. Additionally, under TRID rules, which the TILA and RESPA integration disclosure, a rebate of an agent's commission to the buyer must be stated on the 3rd page of the closing disclosure under other credits. So it is best to have this done through escrow rather than outside of escrow or post escrow. I don't want to say outside, but post closing. Will the rebate affect the loan to value ratio? The rebate should be disclosed to the lender upfront as it may affect the buyer's loan to value. Best practice is to ask the buyer's lender about their policies concerning rebates before making an offer or before writing up your offer. In most cases, a lender may consider a rebate as a type of seller credit for closing costs, so the lender might cap it and limits its use to costs, fees, impounds, and prepaids. And those were those numbers from the seller concessions part, the 36964. So it could be, added to that. So if you have, you're given 2% or 1% or whatever, and rebate from your commission, but you've already worked in 2 or 3% in seller concession, now you're hitting your cap or maybe going over it, and they're not going to apply the full amount. So you have to be careful. You have to know what your numbers are. What happens if the lender disapproves a credit after it's been offered? Well, since you've offered to pay it, only if not disapproved by a lender, then there will be no obligation for you to pay it if you put in that little snippet there. If you forgot to do that, then the buyer may very well have a claim against you for the full amount of the rebate, even after closing. So you want to make sure you word this very properly, so you don't get caught in that position. Be very intentful with how you write your anything in other terms. You have to be very intentful with how you do that, because there's all these other little scenarios that can happen that are kind of out of your control, or maybe you didn't think about. So you always want to be careful when you're writing in other terms. This question comes up a lot. Do I provide the buyer with 1099? Absolutely no, you don't do that at all, because this is considered a buyer rebate with the tax code. The credit or rebate at closing is generally not includable in the buyer's gross income, and therefore is not taxable to the buyer. Rather, it's an adjustment to the buyer's basis in the house by effectively lowering the home's purchase price. So that's how they see it with the tax code. So you don't have to give them a 1099. And the other question that also comes up is, am I going to be liable for the amount that I have rebated as well as income towards me? And the answer is still no in most cases. If you have this done through escrow and it's shown on the settlement statement, and the buyer gets, you give them whatever, $5,000 out of your commission as a rebate, and now your commission amount that you actually receive from Rise Realty is lower, that's the amount you're getting taxed on, not the full commission amount. So it works out best to have this done through escrow. The other way, which I don't prefer, is we have to receive the entire check, and then we can cut the check from the company and then cut to your buyer and then cut the other check to you. It's actually not a check, it would be a direct deposit. But again, then you are only receiving your amount from Rise Realty minus the rebate. So that's what you're going to get 1099 at the end of the year. So I much prefer, and it's much cleaner and better to just have this done through escrow. Then everybody is aware of it. It's just the cleanest to do it that way if you're going to do any buyer rebates. What if you're dual agency? So if the transaction is dual agency, then as a fiduciary to the seller, you have a duty to disclose the offer of rebate to the seller at the first opportunity. So let's say you've negotiated a rebate with the buyer. The seller needs to be aware of this, because for some reason they may not like that. And so they need to be made aware of it. It's material fact. So the fact of the rebate could affect the seller's decisions on negotiating the sale. So you do have to disclose that to the seller. So let's look at building the buyer rebate into your buyer compensation agreement. So we all have buyer compensation agreements now before touring the property or before writing your offer. So what we're looking at right here is actually a snippet from the PSRA, which is the new form. The BRBC works the same. They're both buyer compensation agreements. And here in the other terms, I typed in, unless disapproved by the lender, broker agrees to rebate 25% of any amount received in B2. And if you look at B2, it says payments received by broker from seller. So if broker receives compensation from seller or others pursuant to a term of the prospective buyer's offer to purchase or otherwise, the amount shall be credited against the prospective buyer's obligation to pay broker. And you can't receive, more than what you have in here. So the reason why it's important to tie this part right here back to B2 is because if you were to just say, I agree to rebate you 25% of my commission, well, that doesn't really make sense now on this buyer rebate, on this buyer compensation agreement, because essentially you are making an agreement with the buyer for them to compensate you for services. So what you would say is, hey, you're going to pay me 2% to represent you on this purchase. And of that money you're giving me, I'm going to give you 25% back. And that doesn't really make sense, right? There's really no point in that. And this would be in the event that the seller doesn't pay anything. So we want to tie it back to the amount that you're receiving from the seller or other person. because that is getting credited towards what the buyer owes you. So now let's say you've got an agreement here for 2% with your buyer to represent them. They're going to pay you 2%. You have a contract. And you go to write your offer, you negotiate for the seller to pay 2%, 2% to you for compensation. So the seller is now paying you 2%, which gets credited towards the amount that the buyer owes you. So now you can base your 25% off of 2%. But what if the seller doesn't pay 2% and you can't negotiate it any higher? What if it's 1.5%? Well, you don't want to base this off of 2% because that still doesn't make sense. You want to base it off of the amount you're able to negotiate from the seller. So let's say it's 1.5. So now you're doing 1.5% of what the seller is paying towards the buyer's obligation. So in that scenario, it would look like 1.5%, you're giving 25% rebate to the buyer of the 1.5%, but technically they still owe you another 0.5% at closing. So they will get credit, but they still actually owe you 0.5% in this particular scenario. But you can see why it's important now to state it this way from any amount you're negotiating from the seller, because otherwise it's just, hey, pay me 2%, and of that 2%, I give you 25% back. And if there's no other money coming in against that. So you have to be very intentful now and think about how the flow of this is going to work with the buyer rep agreements in place. So before I go forward, I'm going to check the chats here. How would you write it if it was a cash offer? Truthfully, you can leave it just like this and just use this as your default language in your BRBC in the event that your cash buyer turns into some sort of loan, right? Otherwise, you don't have to necessarily put in this disapproved by lender part, but this is a little bit of a fail-safe should some sort of, loan get put into place during escrow. And that happens sometimes where the buyer's like, oh, I was going to pay cash, but something came up and now I'm going to get a small loan. And maybe whatever the small loan is that they're getting, maybe they don't allow it, a seller concession, or a buyer rebate or something like that. So truthfully, you could just leave it in here. This just won't apply if it doesn't apply, really. But you can use something like this just as your template for all the time if you're running these any sort of buyer rebate program. So next question is, if already in escrow, when the commission was still legal and seller agreed to pay the commission as agreed in RPA, does that stay the same? Stuff that's in escrow is in escrow. Per the NAR fact sheet, just continue with your transaction the way it was. If you fall out of escrow though, and you need to get back in escrow with another deal, then all of that is gone. You need to switch over to BRBC in place and writing your rebate like this, so on and so forth. But if you were working off of the BAC that was offered in MLS at the time you wrote that offer, then that is still honored at this point. We're going to be in a little weird transition period for a week, for maybe a month or two, while previous deals are kind of closing out post August 17th. So looks like one other question. If the seller agrees to pay the buyer's agent's commission, do we put it in the buyer broker agreement? The seller agrees to pay the buyer's agent's commission. No, that goes in the offer. And I'm going to show that next. So this is the agreement between you, has really nothing to do with the seller, because this is the agreement you have with your client, your buyer, for them to compensate you for your services. And they owe you that money. Should a third party, not third party, but the seller or other make a payment to you, you're able to negotiate that, then it gets credited towards what they owe you. but we have to not think about that anymore and tying in the seller with this kind of stuff. This is the agreement strictly between you and the buyer. Now what you're able to negotiate from the seller is on the RPA actually. So actually there's one more Q&A. But the seller agree, no, that was the same question. So, okay. So when writing in a provision into your buyer compensation agreement, like I just did, to provide a buyer rebate, you want to cover a few important aspects. Remember, this is the compensation agreement between the broker, you, and the buyer for them to compensate you for services. Simply writing in buyer's agent to rebate 25% to buyer, the buyer's commission doesn't make sense anymore. And I just went over why. This would essentially read, pay me 2%, I'm going to give you 25% back. Tie the rebate you're offering to any amount received from the seller or others to be credited against the buyer's obligation to pay you for your services. That's why I tied it back to B2 in that PSRA snippet. And then adding in, unless disapproved by the lender, helps protect you from being liable for a rebate payment in a scenario where it's prohibited, even cash. Again, if it doesn't apply, it doesn't apply. There's lots of parts of the contract, the pre-printed contract, that don't apply to a cash buyer. And this would just be another provision in there that doesn't really apply to the cash buyer. But should a loan happen during the escrow process, at least you're covered already. So lastly, how can you provide a buyer rebate if you're also the listing agent, dual agency? So this is kind of important here too. And this gets a little confusing as well. So hopefully I can explain this all right. If you can see, or you can see that we need to be more careful with structuring buyer rebates and dual agency now due to the terms of the NAR settlement. So this is section E of the PSRA, so the buyer compensation agreement. Well, that's it, the property showing one, but the same provision is in the BRBC. Accounting for payments to broker if also represents seller. And it says, if broker has a signed listing agreement with the seller of the property to be purchased, the prospective buyer shall not receive a credit for compensation seller owes broker for representing the seller. So the way I read this is, you're a listing agent, you're only negotiating your fee now. You have a 3% agreement with the seller to sell their home. And then a buyer comes along and they say, hey, I want you to represent me too. You cannot just say, great, of that 3% the seller is paying me, I'm going to give you 0.5% of that, or 25% of that, or whatever, however you want to state that. You can't do it that way now, because the payment has to come. You have to have an agreement with your buyer still. So you need to put a buyer representation agreement or a compensation agreement in place with the prospective buyer. And then you need to ask the seller, hey, I'm representing this buyer over here, and I want you to pay X amount of money, or all of it, of what the agreement I've made with this buyer is. So I made this agreement for 2%. I want you to pay me 2% as the buyer's agent. Let's say the seller agrees. Now your credit can come from that 2% that you've negotiated for the seller to pay you on the buyer side. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, if that tracks. Let me jump into the chat real quick. So if the seller agrees to pay the buyer's agent's commission, do we put it in the buyer broker agreement? I just went over that one. What do we put in the buyer broker agreement if the seller is paying the buyer's broker commission? You have to separate that. That's it, done on the RPA, not in the buyer broker agreement. It's done in the RPA. You have to keep these completely separate now. Like, don't even think don't tie that in with your buyer rep agreement. That is for compensation for the buyer to pay you for your services. Should you be able to negotiate anything from the seller, it's going to get credited against. That goes in the RPA. So let's jump over to the RPA actually, and I'll show you what that means. Oh no, log me out. Give me 1 second. I'll sign back in here. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, logged me out. Let me log back into Zip Forms here. And if you have any other questions, you can pop them in the chat real quick. And I'll get those before I show the RPA. Should be able to wrap up right on time still. Hopefully that last part kind of made sense with the rebate if you're dual agency. That's kind of a tough one to wrap your head around. Okay, back into Zip Forms here. Let me pull up my little demo account. Let me share my screen. Okay, should be able to see my Zip Form screen. You should see the top of the RPA here. If you don't, just let me know real quick. So, so now you have the buyer rep agreement and or your compensation agreement, which probably refer to as that now, because that's really what you have to have. Not necessarily agency, but you have to have compensation agreement in place with your buyer. Sorry, this thing's still booting up, so it's running slow here. So before section G3 here was kind of an optional thing if you had the buyer rep or the buyer compensation agreement in place. Now you need this every time because unless your buyer's just going to pay you, if your buyer's agreed to pay you and they don't care if the seller is going to compensate you or not, then I guess you don't. But this is stating the seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate the buyer broker under separate agreement, which attaches the SPBB. I think I have that in here. Should have attached. Well, I have to scroll through. Sorry. There it is. Okay, so you'll check that box there. So let's say now you're asking the seller to pay the obligation, the compensation agreement for the buyer that you have in place. So let's just call it 2%. You're saying, hey, I want you to pay the commission of 2%, but my buyer also needs a seller concession. So now we're doing both. We're asking them to pay the commission just as they have before all along up until the 17th. So nothing's changed there except for now you're negotiating it, your commission, and then you want to also get 10,000 bucks in seller credit. You'll just put that up here, and then what's going to happen is there's going to be a credit of 2% for commission going towards the buyer's obligation to pay you. That is not included in that 369 cap amount that I went over previously. This is separate from that. It doesn't count towards that. But then you're going to ask for 10,000 bucks in seller concessions. That does go towards that 369 percent that I talked about earlier. And you can see it's going to be a seller credit to be applied towards closing costs. You don't need to put anything else unless for some reason the seller wants to for whatever reason, say I'm only going to offer a seller concession. I'm not going to pay your commission, but I'll give you, 3% total, or maybe it's yeah, let's just say it's 3%, and the maximum was 2 because this is an investment purchase. You're going to want to designate a portion of that to go towards closing costs and the other portion to go towards commission, because now you're over the limit. So that would be like one scenario that I can think of where you want to designate that maybe a portion of it goes towards that, and then some of the other goes towards commission because you're over the seller concession amount, the maximum that you're hitting. But the cleanest, best way is to just attach the SPBB, negotiate your commission with that, and then also ask for the seller concession here to go towards your buyer's closing costs. So now the seller is paying you for your services. Well, essentially the buyer is paying it, the seller is crediting it. And then they're also crediting the buyer for some closing cost funds. So hopefully that clears up how you would write this moving forward to ask for both. Otherwise, if there's no concession, you're not asking for any concession from the seller to go towards your buyer's closing costs. You're only negotiating commission as well as all these other terms. You're just going to attach this SPBB right here, and then you put in your amount in the SPBB right here. So I have a buyer rep agreement in place for 2% for them to pay me. I'm going to ask the seller to pay 2% towards that. Now, if they don't agree, and this hasn't been super clear, I don't think, out there, they will put it in a counter offer now. They'll say, you know what, we don't agree to the SPBB. We're only going to pay you 1.5%. We're only going to pay 1.5% towards the buyer's compensation that they owe their agent. So now you got a 0.5% deficit there. They're going to put that in a counter offer back to you. And yes, that's how we do it now, because essentially this is closing funds for the buyer, and this directly affects the buyer, because they're the one paying you and the seller is crediting this amount towards their obligation to pay you. And then if you say, well, I'm going to ask for it again on, BCO1. So you would just put it as a term in there, seller agrees to pay, or you can say, SPBB 1A to be 2%. You could say that, or you could say seller to pay 2% towards buyer's agent compensation. You can just go back and forth on counter offer now. That's how you're going to do it until they eventually probably come up with a form. I have no idea what they're going to do, but right now you're negotiating on counter offer. So initially it's on the RPA plus the SPBB. And then after that, you're going to do a counter offer, back forth, till you come to your terms. And let's say that the seller says, I'm not going to pay anything towards the buyer's agent's compensation. Well, now the ball is in your buyer's court because they owe you 2%. You have an agreement in place for them to owe you 2%. And so now they need to decide, well, can I buy this house and still pay the buyer's agent compensation? Yes or no? And they can decide if they want to move forward with the offer, counter back other terms, whatever at that point. So it's basically in the client's hands on both sides, 100% on how the compensations are going to be handled now. Because, and you have to explain it to them that way too, that's really important if the seller counters back and says no, or only half this amount or something like that, because you have to let them know, okay, there's going to be another 1% added to your closing costs because they're only paying 1% to cover the compensation costs, and you owe 2%. So they need to understand that is closing cost money. They need to write a check or send a wire for that amount, along with all of their other cash to close. That's part of their cash to close. A couple other questions. Let's see. So G1 and G2 are separate requests for money from the seller. That is correct. One is asking them to pay the obligation of the agreement you have in place. And the other is straight up seller concession, just like it's always been. G1 and G3, yes. Do not combine the concessions. But you could combine both into one concession amount as written term instead of G1, G3. Yeah, you can do this in a number of ways depending on how savvy you get with this. To keep it as simple as possible until you get more familiar and comfortable, ask the seller to pay your commission that you have stated on your compensation agreement with your buyer simply by checking this box and then putting that amount in the SPPP. If you also want to ask for credit for closing costs for your buyer, you will check this box as well, type in your credit amount. And then there will be, so it's two separate asks. You're negotiating two things here from the seller. So just keep that in mind now when you're doing these. And then what'll happen then is, to the previous question about where do you put your rebate and stuff, well, now you're receiving 2% from the seller, in compensation against what the buyer owes you, and you've agreed on your on your compensation agreement to rebate 25% of any amount the seller has agreed to pay. So that's how that circle of life is going to work. So all of the terms that you have with your buyer go on your buyer compensation agreement. Here you're negotiating money to get applied towards all of that stuff that you've agreed to with your buyer. So hopefully that clears that up a little bit. If not, give me a call. Best to keep G1, G3 as separate line items, ensuring the total is not confused by lender. Totally agree with that. Try and keep these separate because there's young underwriters out there, they're new to the business, and you start getting over that cap of 369, 64 amount that's allowed. And yeah, underwriters aren't perfect. I'll just leave it at that. So this will keep it the cleanest. One last question. We have to have a commission agreement in place before we show property. So not making an offer yet. So we don't have an RPA yet. So if the seller agrees to pay the buyer's effects commission, do we put it in the buyer broker agreement? No offer yet, just showing property. Keep it separate from, just don't even think about the seller. Put it in the BRBC or your compensation agreement. You have to have that before you write an offer anyways. That is where the compensation agreement is. You are telling your client, I'm going to go negotiate this commission that we've agreed to. I'm going to go negotiate that with the seller and do my best to have them pay this amount. And that's where you're asking for it right here on the RPA. So you do not make that promise ahead of time with your client, is I guess what essentially it seems like you're asking. And what I'm expressing right now is don't make that promise that the seller will pay it. You have to reframe how you're presenting your services now with your client. And that is, I'm going to go to bat for you. I'm representing you. I'm going to get you the best deal I can, which includes me negotiating this commission amount we are agreeing to get the seller to pay all or most of it. So you have to reframe how you're saying that with your clients now. So hopefully that clears that one up. All right. I think that's about it. A couple minutes over, but this was recorded as always. We put them in our YouTube channel, Rise Realty CA. If you haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe to that because that's where all our videos are. So if you ever need to go check them out again, or if you miss a meeting, you'll get notified that there was a new one. And it's also gonna be in the Rise Realty group as well, the Facebook group. So any questions, give me a call. I know I've had some sidebar conversations with a lot of you trying to cover as much as I can during these meetings. But obviously I can't cover every single scenario, and there's going to be lots of scenarios that come up that we just have not experienced yet that we're going to have to work through together. I haven't experienced them. You haven't experienced them. The majority of the industry has not experienced them. So we're going to be working through some things, obviously, but to get things started, this is, a good start on how to start negotiating offers and things like that, as well as last week's meeting, if you didn't catch that one. So hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you.